Christian, quick question.
Yes,
Is Mark on like almost right at 11?
he's on at 11:02. Yes,
Okay, I'll make sure that happens.
great. Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will be getting started shortly. In the meantime, please enjoy a little bit of a break while we get ready for the main presentation. Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will be getting started shortly. We're just waiting for some more folks to join us. In the meantime, please sit back and enjoy the next couple of minutes while we wait to get the main program off and running. Thanks so much. Good morning again, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be getting started shortly, so thanks so much for your patience. In the meantime, please sit back and enjoy the next couple of minutes while we wait for the main program to get off and running.
Christian, can you hear me reasonably well?
All right, welcome everybody. We will be getting started shortly. Thanks so much for your patience as we get this off and running. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right.
Good morning, Jennifer. Thanks for
Getting
joining
started
us.
very
Oh,
shortly. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Yes, my pleasure. I think I logged on to the public one, sorry.
It's okay. I think it's working. It's working fine. Christian, have people are not yet admitted? They're still in the waiting room. Is that it?
No, so people are in the attendees list. So our audience is here.
Okay.
And we'll just be, they'll just be able to join as the webinar progresses. Yeah. All right, so we're just waiting for a few more folks to join us. Thanks so much for your patience, everybody.
Yeah, no worries. Mark, so the run of show, I imagine you're gonna open it up and then just let me know when you want me to give my remarks.
I'm going to say some very few remarks, a large percentage of which is to thank you. And then I'm going to turn it over to you for welcoming remarks.
Okay.
We are going to mention, I am going to mention the recent guidance and thank DHCD for that. I think I'm going to list the very briefly the topics that are on it, but I'm not going to describe it.
Mark, just so you know, we are live already.
Okay,
so
thank you. Sorry.
All the participants are already here. So you're getting a preview now of what's to come, everyone. You can maybe sign
Sorry
up
about
early.
that. Sorry to everybody. Thank you.
Right, thanks everybody for your patience. We are waiting a few more minutes just to get started. We really appreciate you joining us today. In the meantime, hang tight and we should be getting started shortly. Thanks so much.
All right, good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started now. I'll quickly introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Karina Oliver Milchman. I'm Chief of Housing and Neighborhood Development at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. I'm so happy you all could join us here today for a really good webinar, the second in a series on housing choice, co-hosted by MAPC, MHP, and CHAPA. I want to thank our partner organizations in this effort. And just to get us going, a few quick words on tech. This meeting is being recorded and we're going to distribute the video and other materials after the webinar. You're not on video, so no worries. It is a webinar, so you'll only see the speakers. Participants will be muted and you won't have the ability to unmute yourselves. So please tell us about any technical issues in the chat. Please put any questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A. Our staff will pose them to panelists later on. And if this meeting is Zoom bombed and we can't remove the perpetrators, MAPC reserves the right to end the meeting and reschedule at a later date. But hopefully that won't happen. And now I'm going to pass it over to Mark Trayson, Executive Director of MAPC, for some brief remarks, and then we'll hear from Undersecretary Maddox. Mark?
Karina, thank you very much. And thanks to all the panelists and all the participants. We have over 115 people participating today from throughout the Commonwealth. And we know that the large attendance is largely as a result of the importance of the housing choice legislation. This recommendation, which came from the governor, along with several other sections that were inserted and passed by the legislature, is arguably the most significant change to zoning and housing law in Massachusetts in well over a decade, probably several decades. Our hope is that once it is fully implemented, it will have a dramatic impact on housing supply and housing affordability here in Massachusetts. We've been tackling with these issues for a long time. We saw how the pandemic unveiled the inequities of the housing shortage, who it falls on, who lives in overcrowded housing, how that related to incidents of COVID and homelessness. Not that many of us needed to be told that, but certainly the public saw that throughout the pandemic. And we feel that it is appropriate that toward the end of the pandemic, the legislature finally decided to pass the housing choices legislation and give us some real new tools to try and address these issues. Not every tool we need, not every dollar we need, but a very important start down that road. The Department of Housing and Community Development and the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development have been issuing guidance from the early days of the passage of this legislation. We very much appreciate the fact that Undersecretary Maddox, who's with us here today, Secretary Keneally, who was with us the last time, and their staffs have been working very hard on the guidance, and they've been coming out regularly. Several different guidelines have been provided. We know there is further to go, particularly on what's called the multifamily mandate. It's going to take several months to finalize guidance and regulations on that. There's a working group that many of us are participating on that issue. But even as recently as May 20th, new guidance came out with important additional information and instructions on topics like eligible locations, accessory dwelling units, special permits, mixed use developments, and the very important question of who decides which voting threshold applies to a particular zoning ordinance, whether it's a simple majority or 2/3. We are including a link in the chat of all of these guidances, and would urge cities and towns and others to take a look at it, particularly the newest ones that came out only a few weeks ago on the 20th of May. I want to thank a few people. First of all, and most of all, Karina Oliver Milchman, who has just spoken and will continue to MC this event. Karina does a tremendous amount of planning work with cities and towns throughout the region and oversees her staff in that endeavor, and she has played the lead role in putting this webinar together. I want to sincerely thank Mass Housing Partnership, particularly in the person of Laura Schufelt, and Citizens Housing and Planning Association, particularly in the person of Eric Schupin, for working with Karina and helping her to devise these two events. We know that our partnership with MHP and CHAPA in implementing housing choices and helping our cities and towns to implement it is going to go on long after these webinars are finished. On my staff, I also want to thank Christian Brandt and Elise Harmon, who provided a tremendous amount of support getting us to this day and will continue to do so through the event itself. All of our panelists, Tiffany, the mayors and managers, and everyone else, everyone on the panel is a very, very busy person. And we deeply appreciate the fact that you have made 90 minutes of your precious time available to help really lead and instruct lots of people participating in this webinar about how they might make housing choice a success in Massachusetts. And certainly a leading person in that endeavor is the wonderful Undersecretary of Housing and Community Development, Jennifer Maddox, who I count as a colleague and also as a friend. We are very pleased to have her with us here today to give some introductory remarks and welcome you all. Thank you so much. I will now turn it over to the Undersecretary. Jennifer.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate the kind words. Good morning, everyone. I am so excited. I am so excited to see these sessions are well attended. I believe more than 250 local partners signed up for today's session. And thank you to the team at MAPC for setting up these opportunities for our municipalities to learn how they can leverage new zoning. I want to thank our legislature for passing housing choice. As you all know, our administration has been advocating for this zoning reform since 2017, so our cities and towns can move forward. It took a few years, but thanks to the tireless advocacy of partners like MAPC, CHAPA, MMA, and mayors from across the state, we got it done. And of course, our Housing Choice Initiative has become much more than just the legislation. It also includes technical assistance grants and exclusive awards for communities that have reached the Housing Choice designation. We now have more than 70 Housing Choice communities, and we hope to continue recertifying current communities and see more become eligible for this distinction. The changes made to Chapter 40A through the Housing Choice legislation represent the first substantive reform to our zoning code in 25 years. It's no surprise to anyone here, but Massachusetts has been in a housing crisis for nearly the last decade. From 1960 through 1990, Massachusetts permitted and built a lot of housing, but development dropped dramatically in the 1990s, and we haven't been building nearly enough since. We know what the result has been: some of the highest rents in the nation, in an incredibly strained housing market where low supply has pushed home prices up and made home ownership out of reach for many. Housing prices in Massachusetts have risen faster than any other state, and we are just behind Honolulu, New York City, and San Francisco in average rents. While we love to be number one, this is a category it is not one to be proud of. Lack of housing supply has led to heavily rent-burdened households, overcrowding, and has driven many out of the state. This past year has shown just how critical safe, quality, affordable housing is to the health of our Commonwealth. And as we move out of last year's health crisis, I do not want us to forget that. Our current housing market is just not sustainable for our families or our workforce. It is an issue of equity and of economics. There is a solution, but we really need every city and town to be a part of it. Build more. We need to build more housing of nearly every kind, and we especially need it near transit, near town centers, and in communities in every region. We need more housing that meets our current and future needs, which means more dense housing, senior housing, affordable housing, starter homes, and multifamily housing. We have incredible resources to support the development of affordable housing and housing resources, including housing vouchers. But without the projects to fund or the units to fill, we cannot fully subsidize our way out of housing instability. One of the greatest struggles for families with state or federal housing support is just finding open units. Our municipalities can be leaders in housing. You have the power to make zoning code work for our shared goals, and you can advocate for change. With a more level playing field, we can make zoning changes that meet the consensus. I am thrilled to see interest in these webinars, and I'm excited our local partners to take the first steps towards more housing opportunities in their communities. Especially as we look forward, I think we have an incredible opportunity for communities to refocus and make thoughtful, smart plans for community and economic growth. Thank you again to MAPC for hosting these sessions. We at DHCD look forward to being a partner for municipalities committed to housing development.
Right, thank you so much, Undersecretary Maddox. So now we're going to hear from Dr. Tiffany Manuel, or Dr. T as she prefers to be called, President and CEO of the Casemate, an organization dedicated to helping leaders build the public will needed to advance systems change. Dr. T works with leaders and change makers around the country and to build strong communities that are diverse, equitable, and inclusive. She holds doctorate and master's degrees in public policy from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and a master's degree in political science from Purdue University. If you have questions for Dr. T, please add them to the Q&A. She's going to join after the panel when we take questions from the audience. So thank you so much, Dr. T, for joining us today. I'll hand it over to you.
Great, happy to be here, everybody. So I just want to first certainly thank you for the invitation to participate today, but I also want to just say congratulations. Y'all are doing some things that a lot of folks around the country are still struggling to do. And I know because I worked with many of you that it's taken not just a long time, but a lot of energy and effort and dedication, a lot of long nights strategizing, trying to figure out how to get folks up and over some of their opposition and just reticence to move forward on housing choice. And you've been able to do that in a way that is instructive for many states across the country. So I work with a lot of folks across the country, many of them still struggling to do what you all have just done. So I just want to start with just a little bit of a woosah moment. Just take a deep breath. Just like, you know, in this day and age, you gotta start by just celebrating, right? The large and the small moments where you feel like, you know, you're winning, right? So just take a moment. You know, and Jennifer, I love what you talked about after 25 years of not having the kinds of changes in our zoning systems that we desire. After 25 years, finally being able to get to this moment just requires just a little bit of, oh Lord, as my grandmother used to say. My grandmother used to say, oh, the good Lord bird, you know, right? So you know, let's just take a moment to celebrate, right? To just say that we've been working hard and that has been an important part of the journey. I'm going to work y'all hard today, as I usually, you all know that when you come to any session that I'm a part of, I'm always pushing you all to do more, but I just want to make sure that we're acknowledging the hard work and dedication and sacrifice of folks who are doing this work. And a lot of times that is not always, you know, that does not always come back in the size of our paychecks, right? As benefits to us, that does not always come back in the form of, you know, large fame and fortune and all the things that we're taught as Americans that you should be running after. And so I think that it's especially important to celebrate when folks, you know, are not chasing those things, but are just trying to make sure that we all live in a community where people have the opportunity to thrive and get the housing they deserve. Like, it shouldn't be so hard to get there, but for a lot of reasons, we know that it is. So I love the theme of today, which is getting to use. I have a little bit of, I don't have a long presentation. So I just got just a little bit of some pre-comments before we get to the panel. But I love this idea of getting to yes. This idea of getting to yes is so important. I write a lot about it and talk a lot about it in terms of the work that I do. So I would love to share with you all just a couple thoughts as I'm thinking about housing choice and where you are today and how to advance the work. So if you'll just go with me for a couple minutes before we get to the panel, I'd love to just kind of share some of the case-making principles that can be helpful to you all. So first of all, let's just tell the truth, right? Housing choice is going to require a lot of work, and it's disruptive work, right? Folks across the state have figured out ways of working with each other. They have, all your housing departments have ways of working together and doing the things they've always done. For 25 years, we've been working this way. We have a way of doing it. It goes, right? There's a whole process of things that is already in place to address the issues that y'all are trying to raise and trying to move forward. This is highly disruptive stuff. You're the guy at the bottom bringing in this whole new set of things that have got to be fit into a set of widgets that are already working together. And when I look at this, it's not just in terms of government, but it's, you know, working with the private sector and government and community-based organization and community residents. There's a whole lot of stuff happening here. And so this really requires you all to work with a whole set of folks and get them to work differently than they have in the past. That's a huge undertaking. So that's a part of why it took so long, right, to pass this, and how much years and years and years of dedication, because what you're asking folks to do is to disrupt a way of working that was essentially making it more difficult for us to produce and preserve and protect folks in terms of housing. So thinking about that, you got a lot of different, not just that you got a lot of those wheels, but but folks are operating at different levels. For some of you, it will be changing the way that your internal staff works, right? Especially for some of the sort of government agencies that are working on some of these issues. You got to change the way your staff is working around these issues, the workflow that you got going on. For some of you who are doing affordable housing as, you know, nonprofits or develop, you changing the way that so you understand the regulations and you understand how to work within the context of these new guidelines. So you're changing all of that workflow with your community partners. You're changing the way and working how you work with the transit system folks and how to fix. I mean, just right. You're asking people at various levels of this work to work differently, and a part of the, let's just call it, I won't call it difficulty, a part of the opportunity, because this is an opportunity, we don't see it that way. A part of your opportunity is to help folks make that transition. And I just want to just make sure we're really apprised to that part of the work. You know, Peter Drucker, who many people think he's the guy that when you go to business school, they you know, teach all the incoming MBA students about Peter Drucker, and Peter Drucker is the guy who's always quoted. But Peter Drucker has this saying, he says often that culture trumps strategy, or that culture eats strategy for breakfast. What is he talking about when culture eats strategy for breakfast? What he's talking about, and he's the sort of, would say, the father, if you will, of kind of change management in organizations. He's talking about that even if you've got a good plan, you've done your strategic plan and you've got a good plan for how the organization is going to work or how the ecosystem should be functioning, if you don't change the culture, that culture will subvert the very nature of the strategy that you've put in place. And so what I want to say to you is, this is largely about a change management process in the ecosystem of how a lot of folks across the state of Massachusetts work vis-a-vis, right, the production and preservation of housing across the state. So our corollary to that, or the way that I think about that in case making, it's a little bit different, would say dominant narratives, the way that people are showing up already to this issue, can eat some very good policy making if we aren't very careful to make sure that we are changing and shaping the mindsets of people at all levels of the work who need to do this, right? And sometimes I'm asked, some folks will say, well, Dr. T, we've already won the policy. People have to show up and it's the law, right? And so all we have to do is enforce the law. But I can tell you, and you all know this, there are so many ways folks can subvert these kinds of issues. They can resist, they can oppose, they can challenge, right? They can develop workarounds to get around the stuff that, right, to get around housing choice in various ways. They can spend all of their creativity and energy trying to subvert, right, the policies rather than lean into them. That's not what we want. We want folks who are using all of that creativity and energy to figure out how we do this well, figure out how we develop a process for making it work, to how we are incredibly efficient, even how we even improve the way that we do this work. And so that's what I'm asking us, it requires us to do. And your ability to make the case for housing choice stick with those stakeholders, as you all know, so that the enforcement works well, the way we're working on this well, people are not opposing and trying to be oppositional even at this point. They are excited about what this means for the state and their individual communities. They're excited about their role in it. They're showing up with a can-do attitude about how we get to do this work even better, right? They're leaning forward, right, out of excitement about what this could look like and what can happen in Massachusetts because of this. And so that's the case making work, right, that you and I have to do, not just the, right, explaining, right, what the actual law, what the provisions of the legislation. So we're going to talk about that. So anybody, I know there are I work with lots of folks in Massachusetts in the housing space. So many of you have already seen, I cannot have a presentation where you don't get the hands. You're going to get the hands, folks. I'm going to lay hands on you every time, because these are the sort of core principles of case making, strategic case making. And I'm always trying to reinforce those with you in various ways. I'm going to just talk about one of these today. One that I usually don't have the opportunity to talk about very often, which is this last one, share your roadmap and metrics for success. This is about that last one on the right side of the screen. Is one that's really about your call to action. And it's so perfect for the theme of our conversation today, which is getting to yes. One of the chapters in the strategic case making book that I've written, the last one on this particular principle, talks about inducing a yes state, right? Especially with respect to your call to action. You all are calling people to the action of leaning into the policy that has been passed, right, across the state, and asking them, right, to lean forward and say yes to what you need to actually enforce and move the policy into being. So I want to talk about this, right? Now I have a whole chapter in the book about how you get people to say yes and what your roadmap for success means in terms of getting people there. And I want to just give you a little bit of, there's a part of which and I talk about this of the 7 yeses. So if any of you on this call have ever done any level of marketing, you know about the rule of 7, right? Any marketing person will tell you today that you learn very early about the cognitive science about 7 yeses. There are 2 versions of it, right? I'm going to talk mostly, I'll talk about both of them. The first rule of 7, and stay with me for a moment because I'm going to veer up housing for just a second. The first rule of 7 in marketing is that for a brand or for an idea, that people have to hear it 7 times, right, before they digest the information. That's the rule of 7. From a marketing standpoint, a brand will say, if it's whatever it is, you know, that you have to hear their branding and hear their wording 7 times before you're likely to go out and either buy their product or invest in it. Now, you all have heard me say this in other contexts. I will tell you that toothpaste in this country is marketed better than affordable housing, right? So for those of you who are saying, well, why do we have to think about marketing and branding? That's not what we do. Well, let me tell you, because while we're not selling toothpaste or shoes or whatever, we are trying to have people digest the idea of what it means to be able to absorb the notion that this is an important part of the work that we need for Massachusetts. So the rule of 7 is that people have to hear the message or be exposed to it 7 times before they'll lean into it. Think about this. It's the reason if you ever watched a movie and you're watching maybe, you know, network TV, and the same commercial will come on like over and over. And every time, like we'll have a McDonald's commercial and the same commercial comes on. And you're like, why do they keep playing the same commercial over and over again? Because corporate marketers know that if they can get you to see that thing 7 times, if like think about McDonald's, they put the thing on 7 times, they can get you to lean it. The next time you're out, and you're like, right? So, and from a marketing standpoint, the exposure to an idea, right, at least 7 times is the sort of number that they know they need to get to in order to have you lean forward in that. When we think about case making, there's a corollary to that in terms of the 7 yeses, and I write about that in the field guide. And I talk about inducing a yes state. If you can get people to say yes 7 times to the smaller things, that when you're asking for the bigger things, right? If you can get small yeses, you can get to the bigger things. And I talk about, for example, the way that AARP does this, or some of the insurance companies, they'll say to you, as the American Association of Retired Persons, they use this too in their marketing. They'll say, if we can, you know, the small yeses, can we send you, though, if you're thinking about some, can we send you, I read about it in this book, with no obligation, we'll send you a flashlight and a keychain if you'll agree to have us send you our information. And you say, yeah, you can do that. Yeah. And you might be thinking, well, they want to send me a keychain and a little whatever that is. They don't care about the keychain. What they're getting you to do is to say yes to some of the small things. So when they get to the larger things that they want to ask you to lean forward and say yes to, you'll be willing to do that. It's the same thing that happens if you've ever gone to buy a car. Some of you may not know, sort of recognize the sales technique that they're using, but when a car salesman will come to you and they'll ask you a question, that seems like a no-brainer. And they keep asking these questions and I write about it in the field guide. So they may say, if I could get you the best financing rate on this car today, would you consider buying it today? And you go, yeah, maybe. And then they say, if I can get you the make, model, and color of your choice right here today in the showroom, would you consider it? I mean, would that be and you go, if it's what I want, why not? Yeah. And then if I could get you if I could be anybody's price in this region, I could get you even under MSRP, would you sit down with me and just look at the options? And you're like, yeah, okay, I don't mind. Right? You think, and you may be thinking, why is this guy asking me these like silly questions? Because from sales technique, we know cognitively, your brain, right? The more that you're able to say yes to the small things, if they can get you to say yes 7 times, they can get you to something that's bigger. So here's what I want to say. You may be asking me, Dr. T, are you asking us to become car salesmen or sell whatever, right? No, that's not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is cognitive science and how we help folks, right, lean in when they might otherwise be predisposed. So let's talk about the ways in which some of that cognitive science might apply to the way that we're talking about having people say yes, even some of those who might be otherwise not so predisposed. So one way to think about it is, number one, make whatever story we're talking about in terms of affordable housing sticky. Repeat it often, right? You want to get that repetition, right? In the same way that corporate marketers know they got to get you to see that commercial, whatever it is, 7 times before you're willing to buy their brand or willing to see whatever it is. Get it out there often. For some of you who've been able to read Chip and Dan Heath's book, they call it Made to Stick, why some ideas survive and others die. They talk about repetition, right? So think about that in your organizations when you're talking about housing choice, right? What's the story that you're going to tell? And you need to repeat, 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 and then repeat it 4 more times. You want to get the story of what housing choice does for our families stuck in people's heads. And here's the thing. Sometimes people ask me, well, Dr. T, some folks are opposed to our ideas. And so is it worth it to keep repeating it when they don't come forward? Yes. What cognitive science also tells us is even when people initially oppose the idea, right? It's a song that you hear, you don't even like it, but it keeps playing. Over time, what happens is whether you like it or not, your brain begins to digest that information. So from a vantage point of how we are thinking about housing choice, we're going to get a story about what the benefit of that is. And that can be within your institutions and organizations, that can be across your coalitions, doesn't matter. And you're going to repeat it, repeat it, repeat it so that it begins to get not just familiar, but stuck in people's head. And what will happen is, right, and we know this from a lot, is that people will begin to recognize it. There's a lot of cognitive science around this. So let us take the opportunity to lean into, right, what that means, to lean into the cognitive science around that. So the second thing I'll say is, as we talk about, we're pushing housing choice language and getting people around the idea of what it means to be enforcing housing choice in the right way. Number 2, make people want to be part of the story that we're telling and give them a way to participate in it. And the reason this is important is because housing choice doesn't have a very sexy story here, people, right? I mean, think about all the things that are typically in the news that people want to be part of. Like you got Black Lives Matter and like lots of folks who want to be part of it. And you got the Me Too movement, lots of folks who want to say, yes, I want to be part of that movement, or the gun control movement. They want to be part of it. They want to be part of that story, or any number of things that are more popular in terms of how people connect to it. When you start to talk about zoning and zoning reform and connecting it to transportation and by right access, people are like, what? I don't even know right? I don't know I don't even want to be part of it, so I don't even know what the story is about. But also because a lot of the technical aspects of the legislation are technical, it's hard for folks to wrap themselves around it or see themselves as part of that story. And so what I would say to you is we have to do both things. We know we not only have to get people thoughtful about I would say the sort of winning in the courts, right, around these issues, or winning in the sort of court of policymakers, but you got to win also in the court of public opinion. And so if we cannot get people to see themselves as part of the story we're telling, we're going to lose this conversation. Because even if we win the sort of the political will battle, if we lose the public will conversation over time, we don't get the long-term enforcement mechanisms, and we don't get the support that we need to make this really work. So for some of you who were on a call just a couple of weeks ago when I did a fair housing presentation with the Wayfinders, I talked a lot about this example in the fair housing world. And I talked about this issue of what happens when a very technical set of rules in the housing space is misunderstood by the public. And you get something like this. I gave the example of the AFFH, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing is really kind of it's thought to be an administrative kind of bureaucratic thing where bureaucrats get together and they do some kind of, this is the way the public thinks, some kind of assessment to see whether or not certain groups are left out, right? But most people don't connect to it in the same way. And so you get a lot of comments like this one. This was just the story I took out of the New York Times, with just one comment of somebody talking about, listen, discrimination in the sale of housing shouldn't be tolerated, but it's a very different thing to say there's some affirmative duty of every community to directly affect, to reflect the nation's racial and ethnic diversity, right? When you think about what housing choice does, there's a lot of similarities here. That is there a duty to make sure that every single community across Massachusetts reflect, right, what we need in terms of the issues around affordable housing. And so if we aren't able to get people to see themselves inside of this story and to connect to it, we're going to lose the ability to bring them forward. What I talked about in the fair housing work was you got to have some kind of metaphor or some kind of way that people can understand this as not just a bunch of bureaucrats running around, right, with zoning charts and rules and regulations and by right this and right, that they connect to it in a way that is very on a very human sort of level. On this issue, I gave this example of talking about the AFFH from the vantage point of a checkup. You know, having our city, here's some sample language in that regard, having our city comply with the AFFH is like going to the doctor for a checkup. Nobody really likes to go to the doctor, and we hate the copays, but we all recognize the benefits. Doctors do an assessment of your health, and if there are issues, the earlier those issues are detected and addressed, the best chance you have for getting the right treatment quickly, avoiding life-threatening complications. AFFH operates like that. It gives us the tools to do the kind of periodic checkup we need to see where there are problems, brainstorm about how we solve them, and make sure that we're on the right course for everybody's success. But when we fail to get our checkups, we fail to give our city the best opportunity for long-term prosperity and sustainability. In that context, I don't have to know a lot about the AFFH, but what I do know is I better get my checkup. And I don't like to go to the doctor. I don't like the copay, but I darn well know, especially for me and some of us on this call, I'm 50 years old. Some of you may be around my age or older. Listen, I'm telling you, right, after 50, you get those checkups, right? Because right, the expiration date, you know, on you is, you know, right? So for a lot of us, we don't, you know, you may not like the sort of housing plan as it states, but you understand the value of a checkup. The same thing is true about the way we have to begin to talk about housing choice to average, you know, Massachusetts folks. When they look at what we're doing, they go, what are y'all focusing on? Zoning. We need to be out with Black Lives Matter. We need to be we need to be what, you know, right? You can say, yeah, but you know what? Housing choice in Massachusetts is like, and talk about that in very, very real terms. I won't dictate to you all what metaphors you should use. You all know the kinds of things that make, you know, folks in your community, right, that have them understand things better. But you could do something like this, talking about a biking trail. That, you know, housing choice in Massachusetts or in this community in Amherst is like, you know, the biking trails we have. Everybody wants to be on the bike trails, but when there's, you know, a huge tree that's fallen in the middle of it, making it impossible for folks to pass, right, then the trail doesn't get used, and you got a lot of folks sort of backed up trying to use it, but without the ability to do that. Housing choice is like our ability to remove that tree so more people can enjoy the infrastructure that we've intentionally built for the health and well-being of our citizens. That's what we're trying to do. We're removing that tree so that all of us enjoy the benefits of the infrastructure and the health and well-being that we all want to enjoy. So help us remove the tree. Here's what that means, right? You got to have by right this, you got to, so then you can start going down the list. But the way that you get people to embrace it is by relating it to something that makes sense for them in their own personal lives. They may not know all the provisions, but they darn well know when they're trying to use those biking trails, right, what happens when they can't. Or you can also say a bridge, right? If you're on the bridge, you got lots of honking cars trying to get past a bridge. If you've got a tree that's stuck in the road, it just doesn't work. So you got all these cars, doesn't work, right? The whole purpose of building a bridge is to get to the next destination, right? Housing choice in Massachusetts is like that. It's removing that out of the way so we get the kind of production and preservation that makes the ability for lots of folks to own, to rent, and to enjoy the homes that we've invested in across the state. So the second sort of getting people to yes is giving people the ability and the desire to be part of the story that we're building. Because if we don't include them, right, I would say the general public in this conversation, we get killed in the court of public opinion, even though we have political will, right, to move this issue forward. The last one I want to say, and I can say a lot more, but I'll leave it to 3 today, which is name the power of the moment to shape the future. Name the power of this moment, right? This is a really powerful moment. We all know, we all think about this in terms of a whole range of issues, but I think about naming the power of the successes of this moment. People are often very cynical about change. And when you say, hey, we've changed zoning and we're going to have this and we're going to do that, people can be very cynical. And so our ability to get people up and over that is in part about our ability to remind people about the power of something positive that can shape our future. So some of that can be just what's happened all across the country, and Massachusetts is no different from the rest of the country. When COVID-19 happened, we got real ingenious. We got real creative about how we got people off the street, right? In ways that we had never done across this nation before. I mean, think about that. Very quickly, we figured out, right? Those of us in the housing space knew how to do this, but we figured out across the nation how to get people off the streets, right? In that moment. We figured out, right? This is an incredible moment for partnership. This is the Jersey program where the Housing Finance Agency has paid hospitals to build housing. We are creating these incredible partnerships and collaborations. I would say in Massachusetts, y'all have been incredibly thoughtful in creating partnerships across housing and transportation. Wow, we are building the kind of endurable partnerships that build a foundation for solving a great many challenges across the state. Talk about the power, the momentum of this moment. I would say, and all across the country too, we've seen partnership across groups that normally would never even speak to each other. This is in New York, where the landlord and tenant association groups have joined forces. They don't even usually talk to one another. They're always on opposite sides of legislation and issues. But for the first time, probably in 30 or 40 years, they have found some common ground. While that's unlikely to last for the long term, in the short term, you got folks talking with each other, trying to work together, lobbying together, that have not probably ever been able to do that. There's a lot of power in this moment. And I mean, think about all the other things happening in this moment, even around just where we are in this nation. We just gave 30 million doses of a vaccination, right? In the number of about 5 months or so. 137 million people, almost half of the US population, have been now vaccinated, right? That's what we have been able to do as a nation, right? Think about the surplus checks. I mean, I think the feds passed the surplus on like a Tuesday, and by Friday, people started receiving checks in the direct deposit accounts. Wow, right? So for those folks who said government can't act very quickly, government is inefficient, we can't solve it. Well, look at that, with the right motivation and the right public will. Look at how we are, right? The PPP money, or even the CARES money. Look how many organizations worked in collaboration with each other to get that money out the door directly to where it belonged. Even think about on the little level, how much mutual aid is happening within neighborhoods and communities. I think mutual aid societies or things across this country have grown exponentially. Neighbors just trying to help each other, right, through some tough times. Think how many hospitals have had to retool what they do, all kinds of things. Even I was just talking yesterday with some folks in Evanston, Illinois, who have created a reparations, right, for slavery and other kinds of reparations program that is directing those reparations into housing funds. First of all, the whole idea that we're talking about reparations and having something actually pass at the municipal level is unheard of. I mean, that's extraordinary. And then that people have seen the opportunity to invest those resources in helping people get housing. Extraordinary. We are at an extraordinary moment, folks. And so what I would just remind folks is get people excited about that, because you want to get people up and over their cynicism that housing choice is just, right, housing choice is just some side of it. It's not going to work. We can't do it. It's just some kind of bureaucratic thing now where they're going to, no, this is an extraordinary moment, and it's our efforts that are going to give life to it. So I want to stop. I want to just say, just getting people to yes. In my book, I talk specifically about how you get people, how you induce how you get people to this conversation about yes. And on this conversation, I said, listen, number one, make the story sticky, repeat it. Let's learn from our corporate marketing colleagues, right? We're not going to be left out of the 7 yeses. We're going to repeat it until people understand that housing choice is not only important, but is a huge benefit to our communities. We're going to repeat it. We also want to make sure people want to be part of the story, and we're going to give them ways to think about it, to be part of it. We're not going to just go out with the formal regulations and put everybody to sleep, right? Which is what usually happens, right? We're going to give people metaphors or ways that they can see what we do as clearly, directly important to their lives, and give people a way to relate to it, so they don't just see what we're doing as a bunch of bureaucrats as creating new regulations for folks to run around and have to enforce. And the third thing is we're going to name the power of the moment. This is an incredible opportunity to be doing this work at this particular time. It cannot wait. It is urgent and it is important. And here's to talk about the value of this particular moment. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to sort of open. I know we're about to open up to a panel where we're talking specifically about getting people to yes, which I think is such an important conversation to be having at this moment. I'm going to stop there. Karina, I think you're on. There you go.
I think you're muted, yeah.
It's going to happen to someone at every Zoom event, right? Today it's me. Thank you, Dr. T, and thank you so much for making the time not only to join us, but to stick around through our panel and be available for questions after. I know we have a number of really great questions in the Q&A already. So we're going to switch gears for the next 30 minutes or so before we get to Q&A and move on to our panel discussion with city leaders from around the region. They're going to talk with us about how they've built support for residential rezoning. So before we kick that off, just another quick reminder, if you have questions for the panelists, please do put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat if possible. And Christian Brandt will pose some questions to Dr. T and the panelists following our discussion. So I think we'll kick things off first. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and I'll go in the order of what I see on my screen. So we'll start with City Manager Tom Ambrosino from Chelsea. Tom?
Thanks, Karina. Hi, I'm Tom Ambrosino. I'm the City Manager in the City of Chelsea.
And do you want to give one or two lines about what kind of zoning initiatives you're pursuing in Chelsea or have pursued recently?
So we had a couple of successes before Housing Choice, particularly two big ones. We had a significant inclusionary zoning amendment that passed to increase our requirement from 10% to 15% and to lower the level of affordability. So previously it was all at 80%. It was 10% of the units at 80% affordability. We changed that to 15% of the units at a mix of 30, 50, and 80% affordability. And so that was a real success. And we also recently approved a smart growth zoning district to allow for a really dense and significant public-private partnership project where we're demolishing 96 existing public housing authority units and building 324 mixed-use units in which the 96 public housing units will be interspersed throughout the development. So that required a major zoning change because the density was larger than anything the city had ever done, over 100 units an acre. So those were two real success stories. And I'm pursuing right now a couple more density changes and hope to get those passed with a pure majority vote under Housing Choice, probably coming up for a vote at the City Council meeting on June 21st.
Wonderful. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. Now, Salem Mayor Driscoll.
I am Kim Driscoll, lucky enough to be the mayor here in Salem, Massachusetts, and pleased to be joined by Tom and Lisa and Kevin, other local municipal officials, to talk about this housing issue. We've had some interesting discussions in Salem around housing, most recently accessory dwelling units, inclusionary zoning. Really want to thank MAPC not only for this panel, but for all their work. They've been part of the journey through a process called Imagine Salem, where we really thought about our 400th anniversary and what type of housing options we wanted to have based on our housing demand study. And the needs are so great in Greater Boston, and we're trying to work hard to both expose what the data tells us and put people in a position to maintain a community where different income levels, different backgrounds, different cultures all can coexist. And that's increasingly hard in Greater Boston. So these panels and our opportunity to take advantage of zoning to keep our community character is really critical. So thank you.
Thank you. And we'll move on now to Kevin Kalkut with the Select Board in Norfolk.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today. My name is Kevin Kalkut, and I've had the pleasure of serving on the Norfolk Select Board for the last 3 years here in Norfolk. As with many smaller bedroom communities across the Commonwealth, Norfolk has really endeavored to balance smart growth in line with community vision against the affordable housing requirements of Chapter 40B. In response to the recent influx of residential-only 40B projects being proposed around our town center, we created a town center zoning committee in 2019 to review our current zoning and to provide recommendations to shape development in a manner more in line with the expectations of our community. After a long process and with the contributions of our engaged residents, experienced municipal employees, local board and committee volunteers, and admittedly one very exhausted professional resource from MAPC, our slate of 8 zoning proposals for town center gained the support of the community and all passed at our 2021 annual town meeting.
Fantastic, congratulations. And our fourth panelist today is Town Manager Lisa Wong in Winchester.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And of course, it's lovely to join this wonderful panel. So the town of Winchester underwent a major rezoning of their central business district in 2015. I've been town manager since 2018 and came in really on a wave of a number of plans that are going to shape the future. So in 2017, 2018 is when the town was able to pass their housing production plan. In 2020, the town was able to create and pass a master plan, the first, I think, since the 1950s or 1960s, has a new climate action plan. So there's a number of things that are really gearing towards what the future is going to look like in Winchester. Because of the rezoning in 2015 and because of a number of other initiatives, the town is actually seeing a pipeline of housing projects of over $200 million. And that's from virtually no pipeline a few years ago. So there's going to be significant change. I think a lot of people are excited about it and some not so excited.
Right, and we'll talk more about that today. All right, so I have a number of questions for all of you, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. And I'm gonna direct the first one to Mayor Driscoll, but please, everyone, feel free to chime in with your own thoughts and insights throughout the discussion. So Mayor Driscoll, you recently had ADU zoning pass in Salem, as you mentioned, after prior attempts that were not successful. What did you do differently, or what made the difference this time?
Yeah, thanks, Karina, for that question. I think just about every municipal leader is familiar with the ADU ups and downs in Salem. You know, we had put the measure before our council 3 times. Each time the vote was 7-4, with just having difficulty getting over that 2/3 hurdle. The final version of the ordinance did pass because of housing choice. I really want to call that out as a difference maker for all of us, and the governor and his administration as well, who worked hard to pass housing choice. That 2/3 majority for certain really initiatives that matter in our community is just really hard to overcome. And the final version of the ADU ordinance, I think, is better, right? 1, it's as of right. 2, it's all affordable. Every single new ADU unit created will be below market rate rents, which is exactly the population that is feeling the most pressure in Salem. Folks who make too much to qualify for a subsidy, but not enough to afford high rising rents here. So ultimately, we landed in a place that we're excited about, but it took a lot of time, a lot of energy and of staff and of people, supporters, and those in opposition. But ultimately, housing choice really made the difference. And that came, as you know, Karina, after months of really taking data, talking about housing challenges, trying to do all the community building work. I'm talking pre-pandemic, and asking our own community to rank, what are the policies that you think are most important? And this idea of ADUs rose to the top. And it was just still hard to get over that hurdle, even with the data and the community building and the myth busting, that needed to happen. So I just want to call out the legislation as the thing that I think helped us overcome that 2/3 hurdle, which can be a real hardship. Yeah,
I think a lot of our communities have done everything right in many instances and still just couldn't get over that finish line. All right, so I want to, unless there are other thoughts on this question, I wanted to turn to City Manager Tom Ambrosino, because Chelsea has also passed a lot of really great zoning, and most of it before housing choice, when you did have to hit that 2/3 majority. Can you tell us how you've built support for that zoning, and if you took a different approach with the community as opposed to City Council?
Yeah, so I just think it was a lot of sort of tedious, hard work meeting with residents and community groups to sort of build the groundswell of support for some of the things we were trying to do, and then using that to kind of leverage the city council to go in our direction. I mean, I don't want to say that there wasn't support for affordable housing. So I'm going to focus on really the inclusionary zoning, the affordable housing ordinance that sets aside required set-asides for affordable housing. Surprisingly, despite the large percentage of affordable housing in Chelsea, it had never had a required inclusionary zoning provision. And we thought it was important because the need was great. So we started just meeting with the natural allies that were out there, the groups that were inclined, the housing advocates that were already out there. But we didn't really take them for granted. And we wanted to make sure it wasn't just the leaders, it was their stakeholders and members that were also going to show up at meetings. So we did the hard work of meeting individually with a lot of these groups and just trying to build support, which for most of them wasn't hard because they were generally supportive of the need to sort of bake into our zoning affordable housing. But that is a time-consuming process to build community support. It really doesn't happen overnight. And but that's what we did. And then after we felt we had enough public support, we then we started to work with the council and convince the council members that this was the appropriate time to be moving forward. I will just add a couple of things. One, in both the smart growth zoning district effort and the affordable housing effort, we did try to reach out to some groups that normally we don't. So in the affordable housing piece, we actually reached out to Mass General Hospital. They have a big clinic in Chelsea. They have a big presence in Chelsea. And they were coming to the idea that affordable housing was obviously it's a critical public health need. And so they were finally willing to kind of, even though that was clear in their mission, they were finally willing to try to take public stands on this. And so we engage them in that effort, and we now engage them every time we have a potentially controversial affordable housing proposal before boards. We try to make sure that representatives from Mass General show up at the board meetings and advocate for affordable housing. And in the smart growth zoning district, because it was so essential to this development of this new public housing redevelopment, we started reaching out strongly to our public housing tenants and getting them engaged in the process. And so in both cases, we kind of added to the normal groups that show up at city council meetings to advocate. And we were successful eventually on both of those efforts.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from others on this subject of building support and different approaches with the community versus elected or appointed officials?
I would absolutely speak to the importance of outreach as a vital component to the success of proposals like this. In Norfolk, we engage the community with public discussions, but also to back that up with more informal one-on-one connections was really vital to our success. We did the more standard electronic polls to determine priority. We did the community forum meetings. We did public committee discussions, and they were all great tools, but we really found the most value in those one-on-one, more informal connections with community members that had concerns. This not only provided the opportunity to get direct feedback that we might not have otherwise gotten in public forums, but it also afforded us the ability to address specific concerns that sometimes don't come up until the inopportune moment during the debate on town meeting floor. So staying ahead of those was very important. That same level of engagement also we extended to our local boards and committees, planning, zoning, advisory, Concom, health. Getting them on board not only put forth a united front of alignment to the community, but there was nothing more impactful to address specific concerns the community raised, such as, this zoning is not in line with the vision of our town center, than to have the 5-term chair of the planning board stand up and speak in support of it. So I think on both of those fronts, the engagement was incredibly important.
I want to add to that. I would say, just to reinforce both what Tom and Kevin are saying, there is just such an opportunity right now to engage a wider range of stakeholders than has ever been involved in the housing. We've struggled over a great many years to get folks outside of the housing space to care about, think about, plan with us about housing. And what we're seeing across the country, not just in Massachusetts, is the ability now, because of, I think, the severity of this issue, and the acute sort of lack of affordable housing and the demand being so strong, we're now seeing lots of folks, even without very much prompting, being willing to come forward. So this is a moment that if you can tap on some of those stakeholders, I mean, think outside of the box, think radical inclusion. Who else can we get that we might, that we've never thought to engage, that should be and could be involved in this conversation right now? So I just want to encourage folks to really, like, if there's ever a moment where you can get folks to the table who normally wouldn't be at the table, this is it, right? So don't waste the moment. Don't lose the moment to do that.
Can I just build off that too? I think one of the points of inflection for us were our employers. So when we were talking about ADUs, our hospital was there, our largest banks were there, our restaurants and community members. It's even more of an issue now, but I think they really recognize hospitality, tourism, service employees, entry-level positions in healthcare. There just isn't enough housing affordable enough for those individuals. And ADUs, it's not the answer, right? We all know there are buckets of work to support our affordable housing needs, but it was definitely an area where we felt we could help those particular industries, folks working in those industries, to keep Salem more affordable. And the CEO of the hospital, the CEO of banks showed up at the public hearing and talked about why this was important for them from a jobs perspective, from a workforce perspective. And you can't really, that's an important perspective that isn't always at a public hearing talking about housing issues.
Yeah, I want to add to what everyone's saying, and maybe add the perspective of one of the things that you and I had talked about, Karina, beforehand, which was that I've had the perspective of being both a mayor and now a town manager. So when you sort of talked about elected versus appointed officials, sort of what are the differences in those roles, especially when you're engaging in housing efforts in opposition. So I will say, first, what's the same? Process is really important in both roles. Education is super important in both roles. Leadership and messaging are also important. However, I mean, I will tell you, I have a lot more restraints in my role as town manager than I do as a mayor. We have a special election in a few weeks about whether to overturn a recent town meeting vote. And this is particularly hampered my ability to actually speak out or speak on this issue. In my case, I've had a couple of recent interactions where just going out to, get a cup of coffee, I've been able to just run into people who have sort of asked me questions. And I remember proactively doing that when I was mayor. I was sort of part of just being a mayor, and I've missed doing that over the last year. But it really is those informal conversations, especially if you're looking at a vote, not at a town meeting setting or not at a select board or city council setting, but you're looking at a vote in terms of an election. Really, those peer-to-peer conversations are important. These issues are incredibly complex. So any which way we can break it down as, well, this is housing for people we know, our major employers here, there's a tie to economic development. All of those things are important. And the messaging is slightly different for everybody. And that's why those one-on-one conversations matter, because you can have that kind of back and forth that you can't normally have at a public hearing.
Absolutely. So I guess while we're on the subject of messaging, I'm gonna pivot a little and ask Mayor Driscoll, what are some of the key housing messages that you've found to resonate in your community, and also the key alliances you mentioned earlier, working with small businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think the data was really our friend in many respects, being able to talk about the fact that there are, 126, today it's 159 homeless families in Salem Public Schools, that over 50% of our renters are housing challenged and 25% of our homeowners. Trying to put a finer point on, you love the person who pours your coffee every morning at the diner you go to for breakfast, and they can't live here, right? And so trying to make sure people understood who we were talking about. When you say affordable housing, I think everyone has a different bubble above their head when you say affordable housing. And so trying to put a finer point on, who was the affordable housing person we were talking about. We did great work with MAPC on producing videos, so you can actually hear from those individuals. Yes, I grew up here. I want to stay in this community. I love my neighborhood, but I can't. And that was somebody who was a young adult, and there were people who were senior citizens who said, I need another place, right? I'm overhoused, but I want to stay here, and I can't really afford, the apartments that we have, but I could certainly create an ADU. So those voices were important. So that was seniors, that was young adults, that was like League of Women Voters, just folks who could look at, the data before us and call balls and strikes as you see them, and acknowledging that not everyone's going to agree, and then trying to put together FAQs. Is this going to affect our school system? Like, what are the things that people right away pivot to, traffic or parking, and trying to address that and put more of a human face towards the understanding of it might affect traffic, right? We actually might have to wait a little bit longer for where we're needing to go, but we're putting a roof over somebody's head. And so trying to acknowledge that there are trade-offs when you're talking about growth, I think was helpful. Again, Housing Choice did it for us because of the lowering of the threshold, but this passed by a majority. So, it was a 7-4 vote every single time. And it was just the last time, obviously, that actually led to success. And we'll continue to talk about it. I loved Dr. Manuel's earlier presentation, and how do we really make it stick here? People know it's an issue, but how do we humanize it? Is always the thing I think we're looking to try and do better at.
Kevin, I'll turn to you because you probably have different messages resonating in Norfolk. Can you talk about those, and also maybe some of the concerns you've heard about residential rezoning or mixed use rezoning in Norfolk, and how you've kind of strategically pivoted in response to those concerns?
Sure. So, one thing that we've learned over the last 3 years is that opposition is inevitable. But, we kind of framed it in a way that it doesn't necessarily need to be entirely negative. We identified that there's always going to be a segment of the community that, regardless of logic and reason, they're going to fundamentally disagree with the vision. And while understanding their perspective is important, we couldn't let that hold us back from moving forward. Instead, we shifted our focus onto finding a balance between those who view some of the changes as favorable, but others as being relative showstoppers. We embraced their point of view. We invited them to come and speak within these public forums so that we could address their concerns publicly, and also leverage comparative data and backing of experiences from other communities to help bridge the understanding gap of what typically existed in some of those misconceptions. It also helped to build a working relationship with these individuals, and also got some personal investment from them in the process as a whole. I think somebody mentioned before, community education was a huge piece of the strategy to help educate people on exactly what the laws mean and what their impacts have been in other communities. And we also identified that it might not necessarily end with complete alignment, and that's okay. Just the fact that we have the conversation and we get the information out there was the biggest piece of it all. And then finally, you said in regards to pivoting, in our case, we tried to bring these proposals to our fall town meeting in 2019 after 6 months of work. And at the last minute, we heard some pretty troubling feedback from community members who were fairly well engaged throughout the process. So much so, and since we didn't feel like we had the time to really properly address it all, we pulled those articles from the warrant. We regrouped in 2020 with a focus on heavy outreach and engagement. We made some strategic tweaks to the proposals, and then we brought it back this past spring to its success.
That's great. I want to build on this a little, stay on this theme, and turn to Lisa Wong now, because you had some central business district rezoning that was successful and unlocked some pretty great development, including a project that's 75% affordable that hasn't been built yet. Can you tell us about what made that effort successful and some of the concerns that are being voiced today about it?
Sure. I'll certainly do my best, because the rezoning happened in 2015 before I came on board. And my understanding is that it came after many, many years of talking, studies, meetings, consultations, drafting and redrafting of the plan. Probably a lot of the, a lot of kinds of conversations that my colleagues have talked about already. But the planning board chair at the time had said that the town center is important to residents and has potential for redevelopment, but the zoning was so badly out of date, it inhibited investing in development. So I think that message resonated. The spirit of the rezoning is to bring housing, more housing downtown and streamline regulations, but at the same time, was really important to residents is not, oh, streamline regulations, but it was, well, we want to preserve the look and feel of our historic downtown. We want to revitalize the businesses. We don't want to see empty storefronts. We want to have more restaurants. And we've already seen a lot of that come to fruition from having more robust restaurants and retail downtown. But another argument that I think worked well was, adding feet to the street and generating more tax revenue by having that housing right downtown. So the projects that are kind of in the further stages are, these sort of like larger 40B projects happening sort of at the outskirts of town. The ones that are in the pipeline that are that kind of tell us where the town is really ready to go are kind of happening right now. So this is what I'll call lived history. But there was a hearing last year that discussed two projects in particular that would be very transformative. One is turning a single-story beloved hardware store into a mixed-use development that keeps that hardware store, but also adds a retail shop and then adds housing above. The other one is a building that I don't think is beloved by anybody. It's sort of this big white monster downtown that is not very attractive. It had sort of covered in, antennas. So a lot of people are very excited about seeing that that project be redeveloped, and it's right next to Town Hall. But the kind of comments we're hearing is when the concept drawings were brought out is that the building is massive. There are too many swirling, curling patterns. It looks like a factory, something out of Lowell. But another resident looking at the same exact concept drawing said that this is the best proposal I've ever seen. I grew up riding my bike around the pond, and I know change is hard. I've seen a lot of new developments in town, and I haven't seen anything that looks as great as this. I think Winchester would be lucky to have it. This could be the new hot place to be. And then the latest project that I talked about that has a special election that, that's a transit-oriented development right next to the train station on a piece that's owned, piece of land owned by the town. It passed through 2 town meetings by more than 2/3 majority. It's been in development for quite some time. We had concept plans dating back a decade ago, but that's the one with the 75% affordable component. And I have heard some arguments about how, because it's not, let's say, a typical market rate project, brings in less tax revenue, even though that wasn't a main driver of putting that project together in the first place. So like I said, I think the town's certainly at a crossroads as we're looking at our pipeline of projects.
Great. Well, I know many of us will be watching that closely to see what happens with the special election. And then real quick, the city manager in Chelsea, Tom Ambrosino, is having some network issues, so we lost him. I was going to float this out there for him and Kevin, but anyone else who has thoughts on it, please chime in. My last question is about how to package zoning changes so that you can take advantage of the simple majority threshold. And I know that Kevin, you specifically in your recent success thought about this very strategically, so maybe you want to start things off.
Sure. So as we prepared to bring our zoning proposal to town meeting that was 2 years in the making, we needed to make a decision on how to bundle the total of 8 bylaw changes that we were looking to make, ranging from density and shared parking adjustments down to scale and height of the building. We took into account the recent changes afforded by the housing choice legislation, and we opted to group density and shared parking together as an article that would only require a majority vote. And then having the rest of the articles, the rest of the items fall into a second article that required a 2/3 vote. It goes to say that after the vote, both passed fairly comfortably, so it never even needed to go to account. But we did feel that in the event where the 2/3 was going to be difficult to achieve, at least being able to get density and shared parking would be a step in the right direction for our community.
Thanks, and welcome back, Tom. Do you want to chime in on this question? I'm not sure if you heard me, but it was about sort of how to put together the zoning for city council in your case to take advantage of the simple majority threshold. And I know you had a recent stab at this that didn't have the same outcome as Kevin got in Norfolk.
Yeah, so I apologize. We're having some network problems, so I reconfigured my secretary's personal
No
computer.
worries.
So I guess that a cautionary tale from what I did just after housing choice passed. I wanted to get some density changes before the council and take advantage of the new majority rule as opposed to the supermajority. But I was a little too ambitious and packaged some of my stuff all together with some other zoning changes I wanted to make in an effort at efficiency. But I had submitted, so I submitted amendments, some of which required a majority vote and some of which did not. And I tried to alert the council as to how they needed to vote this to ensure that they weren't bundled and that they were separately taken up, so that those that only need a majority would pass with a majority, and those that needed a supermajority, we would see if they were able to attain it. But despite my best efforts, the way the vote actually went, it got fouled up. And as a result, the solicitor determined that the way the vote happened, they were sufficiently combined that they all needed a supermajority. And so it was just a cautionary tale that if I'm doing this again, I will never combine zoning amendments that require anything more than if I have an amendment that's going to require more than a majority under housing choice, I'm not going to include it at all with amendments that only require a majority. Thankfully, I'm coming back to the council before they break for the summer with those provisions that indeed got a majority but didn't pass, and they're now separately before the council with nothing else to interfere with that vote. So hopefully that'll happen in June, but I would suggest not to include amendments to either the city council or whoever your approving board is that combine amendments that require different majorities. I think it's just too dangerous a risk.
Yes, I think we all need little needlepoint pillows that say never combine amendments now. So we can keep that in mind going forward. All right, thank you everyone so much. I do want to leave about 15 minutes for questions from the audience because I know we got some really good ones. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Christian, who will get through as many as there are time for before we need to wrap things up.
All right, hey everybody. So we do have 21 really fabulous questions in the Q&A. So we aren't going to be able to address all of them, and some of them are a little specific. So we'll try our best to respond to those after the webinar in lieu of some of focusing on some more broad questions for the panelists. So our first question, there was a couple of questions like this in the chat. So I'm going to in the Q&A. So I'm going to paraphrase. Essentially, the question is mostly for suburban communities, but we can generalize to everywhere. How do you respond to some of the more common reasons for opposing affordable housing, like pressures on schools, pressures on public service, increased traffic, and the environment?
Happy to start. I think one of the biggest myths in adding housing is that it has a negative effect on schools. We're a city, we want families growing. Many Massachusetts towns are actually decreasing their population. And when we do add children to our schools, we increase the Chapter 78 coming. It's on a per capita basis. So unless you're seeing huge growth in a short period of time, that's going to require you to build new schools, meaning you just don't have the physical infrastructure to support that. Most of the enrollment trends are actually going down because families are having less children. It's really going to be unique circumstances where it turns out to be, a loser for a community. Overall, it's the mix of families that help support older adults and help support, a thriving vibrancy, whether you're a bedroom community or a city. So we sort of take it head on, to be honest with you.
And similarly to what Kim had identified, just to quickly note, here in Norfolk, we are in the process of actually proposing an expansion to one of our elementary schools due to overcrowding. So we anticipated that there would be some very real concerns associated to increasing density for development and the impact on the schools. To stay ahead of that, we aligned the forecasting for enrollment for the next 20 years with some of the studies that are out there that identify the impact of schools based on affordable and dense housing. And once we got the buy-in from the superintendent and some members of the school committee, we were able with confidence to bring that forward and not necessarily have to worry about that being an issue that we brought up at the last moment. So again, just trying to stay ahead of these questions and issues and have the backing of actual data and research was really helpful.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think there are some decent studies out there showing that the impacts from affordable housing projects aren't catastrophic to school systems. So those can be helpful as well.
I wonder if Dr. T has thoughts on this as well, because I know you can stand up in front of folks concerned about schools and talk about data and a lack of a correlation until you're blue in the face, and it doesn't always necessarily assuage their concerns.
Yeah, so we deal with this a lot. This conversation, you know, people, even outside of the housing context, are always concerned about the quality of education for their kids. It is a major concern. Everybody wants their kids to be able to grow up and do great things, and so schools are part of that conversation. What's interesting about this is that people often think about the kids, but they don't think about the teachers and the personnel, the thousands of them that actually need to have housing. And so what I would say a part of the sort of making the case on this is getting data on that piece. We found that if you talk to folks about just the number, not just of teachers, but of school personnel that have got to get to where they work and what that requires, and the challenge of recruitment. Most of our school systems are challenged trying to recruit and retain talented teachers. If you ask any school district what's their number one challenge, that's what they will tell you. And your odds of recruiting and retaining talented teachers get infinitely better when they can live closer to where they work. So this is not just an opportunity to make sure that you've got, right, if there's no overcrowding and those kinds of things, but it's an opportunity to say, if you really care about the quality of the instruction that you're getting and the quality of folks that we're able to retain, then you got to talk about housing, because that's the only way to get it.
Yeah, I love all the points that Dr. Manuel just said. And I don't know if there's Winchester people out there watching this, but it's certainly more powerful coming from your voice than mine. But I will say that at town meeting, when these points were raised, I mean, certain people were trying to put calculations of how many kids were there and how much they're going to cost. And I can tell you that, you know, I think that turned the stomachs of some people in terms of reducing kids to numbers and a cost burden. So those arguments certainly didn't fly at town meeting. And it was great to see the superintendent go up there and really just say, you know what, this is, you know, I'll give you the facts, but, you know, this is something that is supportive. And I think some of the economic arguments that might have hit home a little bit were the fact that, you know, Winchester had one of the lowest, if not the lowest percentage of affordable housing in the state. We were less than 2% at one point in time. So, and we have very limited land. So for us, the issue of safe harbor is very important, and we're in it now because of some of the 40B projects that are in the pipeline. So there's an emphasis on why don't we work with quality, you know, 60-unit housing developments that we get what we want in terms of design and mixture and control, versus losing safe harbor, right? And then having, you know, large scale developments that come in could be a lot larger, could not be as attractive, you know, and I think that argument also resonated. But of course, I've got my ear out there too, kind of listening to all of the things that are happening right now. And I'm certainly hoping that what, you know, Dr. Manuel is saying, that those kinds of arguments will continue to resonate.
Thanks all. I want to get us on to another question because we have only about 5 minutes left, but I think this is a really related question as well. And we got a couple of questions like this again, so I'm sort of paraphrasing, and most of them actually came up during Dr. T's presentation. So this question is, how do you deal with opposition or people who are opposed to any of your projects when they are using the same tactics you are? Specifically, a couple of folks mentioned the tactic about repetition, specifically repeating misleading information.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that. In fact, just I think in about a couple of weeks, we're doing a workshop webinar with some of the CHAPA folks to specifically talk about the art and the science of the pivot, right? You got to learn how to pivot away from that misinformation without repeating it, because you don't want to be the one repeating somebody else's stuff and having them, right, get another notch, right, because you just repeated their information. But there's an art and a science to being able to pivot and reframe the conversation. Part of that is to acknowledge something about what they said, something about that you can agree with. Like, I agree. We all have to be very thoughtful about the way that we're building this community, because we all care about the community. And that's why I am saying that. And you go back to reframing the conversation in a way that is much more constructive to what you're talking about. The good news is, about this, it's conversation about kind of misinformation and that, right? You've got lots of affirmative data that you can share to debunk that. The main part of your conversation is not to repeat what they've done, affirm, right? The right information, back up your sources, and then ask them to do the same.
Could I just add one thing? I think the doctor said something good, which was that I think you have to sometimes acknowledge that some of the negatives that the opponents are bringing up are real. And and whenever we're in Chelsea, they always bring up there's no parking, and your project is going to exacerbate that. And I always say, of course it is. I'm not denying that. It's going to exacerbate the problem. But we're balancing interests here, and we have this huge challenge, and we have to accept some negative aspect of this in order to proceed with what's a greater benefit to the community. And so I think, not trying to pretend that that what they're saying is completely untrue or that there are no negatives, it's just being truthful, but recognizing that it's a balancing act, and and you're advocating that the balance weighs heavily in your favor.
And if I could just throw something there at the end, all of that's been said already is very true. For us, we wanted to, as we got closer to our town meeting and the pivotal discussion in the open forum, we wanted to stay ahead of those things coming up at the last minute. So we created what we designated as an FAQ sheet that essentially highlighted each one of these main concerns with the backing behind why it wasn't something that we were generally considering to be impactful to our decision-making process. So, if you had on there, are you guys making a combo Walmart, Home Depot, and Norfolk Center? No, that's actually not feasible, and here's why, was a great way to stay ahead of some of that commentary.
All right, thank you, everyone. I hate to end on an oppositional note, but I think we are getting to that time. So I want to thank my colleagues for helping to make today run smoothly, and thank all of the guest speakers, Mayor Driscoll, Chelsea City Manager Tom Ambrosino, Winchester Town Manager Lisa Wong, and Norfolk Select Board Member Kevin Kalkut, Mark Drason for speaking, and of course Undersecretary Maddox for her warm welcome. And thank you to all of you for spending your lunchtime, I guess we'll say, with us. And MAPC will follow up with the video from today and other materials, including materials based on the first Housing Choice webinar we had in May. And other than that, have a great weekend, everyone. Go forth and get to yes.